So first of all, going back, what was your earliest introduction to sort of the core British music repertoire as a student or later?
So my earliest memories are when I was a student was going to concerts and hearing English music. Usually I would go and listen to, perhaps I would go and listen to Oyster playing a violin concerto, and there would be an overture by Delius or a symphony by Vaughan Williams. Of course, Elgar was, I mean, these were all favourites of Barbaroli, who I went to a lot of his concerts, because I mean that was the local orchestra to me in Manchester, in the north of England. So, but later on, I became co-leader of the London Symphony Orchestra. And then I was only 20 years old at that time. So now I start to get really kind of involved with the English composers, playing quite a lot of English music. I forgot exactly the year, would have been 1962. We did just when it had been written, we did the first recording of the War Symphony. Now I was concertmaster for the LSO for this recording, and of course we worked a lot of time with Britten himself. So I kind of got to know him because there was a lot of things that we could discuss and so on. And this was a very, very interesting experience. We even went on tour, we went to Italy, and so nobody had ever heard the War Requiem at that time. So this was quite an inspirational thing. Also, I had contact at that time with composers like Bliss and William Walton and so on. Now, I didn't stay with the London Symphony Orchestra for very long because I was really young, and I left in order that I could do, actually I wanted to do a solo career at that time, but for some reason I had only been left the London Symphony for a very short time when the London Philharmonic asked me if I wanted to be concertmaster there. And so I, after arming and all the stuff, thinking about it for quite a while, I decided I would go there. And at that, I went there at a time when there was a recording company called Lyrita. I don't know if you know this company. So Lyrita decided to actually record almost all of the orchestral stuff of the English composers. So I was involved in recording all of the, particularly with Sir Adrian Boult, who of course had great contact with Elgar, and of course Vaughan Williams, etc., and he gave, you know, he had great correspondence from him. I used to go to his house during that whole period, and he used to read me letters from Elgar and so on. And we worked with Walton, most of the English composers who were still around at that time. When I recorded all of the Vaughan Williams symphonies, we did that with Boult, we did that in Kingsway Hall. And Vaughan Williams was, at that point he had died actually, so his wife, I mean, she just was sitting actually almost between Sir Adrian Boult and myself, and she was there for the whole of the sessions, for all of the symphonies and everything. So I became very familiar with that. We also recorded lots of Elgar, of course, the Enigma I recorded many times with different conductors. Some of the films that we made at that time, we did Dream of Gerontius and all of the instrumental concertos. I myself, I suppose the most important piece that I played was I recorded the Britten Violin Concerto, and I got a lot of information about that concerto from Britten himself. So I went down to Aldeburgh and I saw him and I played to him and until he was satisfied or dissatisfied with how I what I was doing with that piece. But at that time, hardly anybody played this concerto, and so I suppose I was either the first or second or third violinist to actually be performing Britten Violin Concerto. And at that time, I performed it quite a lot all over the place. And when I went as leader to the New York Philharmonic, that was my debut concert. I played the Britten Concerto there, and it had received its first performance there in 1939, and then mine was the second time it was played in America, which was in 1976. So there was a massive span of time. There was 36, 37 years between, and it was quite unfamiliar. And now, of course, it's become almost standard repertoire, the Britten Fiddle Concerto now, which I'm very happy to know that the younger violinists and instrumentalists are doing research and dealing with all of the literature that is available to them. Because it's very big, and it has a character which is very, very, I think, it tells you a picture of this country somehow. It paints an atmosphere of what it's all about. Particularly, strange enough, I think of all of the composers, I liked most of all Vaughan Williams.
You've thrown out so many wonderful names in the answer to that question, not only these extraordinary composers, but I think what's most interesting is that your exposure to so much of this repertoire seems to have been through a practical approach rather
Yes.
than in your early education.
Yes.
And of course, many of these composers died many years ago.
Yes.
And so students today or young musicians don't have that as a potential avenue to expose themselves to this repertoire. I'm wondering, throughout your career, how do you feel that the landscape has changed in the concert sphere in terms of the opportunities that musicians nowadays have to maybe expose themselves to British repertoire in this country? Do you feel they have the same opportunities to engage with this repertoire in the concert hall as you did as a young musician?
I would think not. First of all, I think that most of the contact with those great English composers was through the recordings. Now, at that time in the 60s and 70s, before I went to America in 75, but prior to that, we were doing something close to 150, 200 recording sessions a year. A lot of that was to do with recording big cycles of composers. So we would do everything that Bartók had written, or everything that Mahler had written, or everything. Now, in there came everything that Vaughan Williams had written. Then we did Elgar. Now, of course, Elgar was already familiar, and because of the attraction and the contact with everything that is English. I mean, it's kind of based on all those pop songs that he wrote, Pomp and Circumstance, and all of the stuff that we do at the proms and so on. So I think that you grow up being very familiar with all of that stuff. I think that because of the recording atmosphere has changed, not atmosphere, but the recording situation has changed so much because of the internet and the downloading, etc., etc., etc. An orchestra which in my day was recording perhaps 200, as they say, 200 sessions every year, is now perhaps down to 10 or 15. Now, actually, after all of this stuff and playing a lot of the pieces myself, I mean, really lots of pieces, I mean, from at that time, composers who were not really familiar to me. For example, Alwyn was not familiar to me, and yet I suddenly found myself in a recording studio recording his symphonies. And what I remember about him is I really liked his music. It was beautifully written for the instrument. It was very characteristic of the England that I should have known better. And had I listened to more of that music, perhaps I would have been, I think, more familiar with what our history was, because it somehow showed up through that music. And so there were quite a few composers who I worked with, like Walton. I wasn't familiar with Walton's music really at that time, and I got to know him pretty well. Bax, I had some contact with. Delius, who was from the same part of the world where I was born, where I was from. I think it was only 10 miles or something like that. But of course he had died, and he was, but his music, at the beginning I was a little confused with Delius because I found particularly some of the vocal scores, I found them very, very long. And I was a little bit lost. Later on, through listening to, of course, the famous overtures and so on, I became very familiar, and I found that a very beautiful sound. Very, very beautiful sound. What had been a little bit bewildering to me became suddenly very characteristic of where we were.
You talked about how we do things differently over there in comparing the programming habits of, say, British symphony orchestras with ones in the States, and having worked so much with the London Philharmonic Orchestra, the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. It's curious to me how some British composers travel better than others across the Atlantic. So you talked about Benjamin Britten and doing your premiere with doing your premiere performance with the New York Philharmonic. Britain travels so well, but other composers seem not to. Do you have any thoughts on why that might be, or American attitudes towards this?
Yes, I do actually, because I think that Britain was very prominent in the 60s, and there were certain performers who actually not only adored his music, but actually adored him, the whole personality and the flavor of Aldborough and the whole thing, and the music actually is great. I'm talking about performers like Rostropovich, etc., etc., etc. So many. Of course, then he's playing the cello works, he's doing the vocal works with his wife, Vishnevskaya. He's doing, when he started to go out, he started to introduce all of these pieces to the American public as well. And somehow it starts to catch on. And I think it's through the performers, of course it's through the performers, where the music actually gets shown. I mean, if the British Museum, they don't have a painting by somebody, and you want to see it, you can't see it. Doesn't matter how good the painting might be, or painter might be. If they don't have any of those works, you can't see. It's the same for us. So it only takes the inspiration and the dedication and work of performers to actually bring that to the public. It is through that. Now, I remember very, very clearly doing the Enigma Variations in New York with Leonard Bernstein. And it didn't sound English at all. It just didn't sound like an English piece. Now, I'd already recorded the Enigma. I've forgotten how many times, but the most important recording that I did was with Adrian Boult, who used to, when I used to go around his house, he used to read me the letters of Elgar, because Elgar was his friend, and he told him about the pieces that he was writing, etc. But the Elgar the Enigma Variations done by Boult was unbelievably like going into it was like going into a great English park. Suddenly when I did it in New York, Bernstein, who I really adored, and probably arguably one, if I have to name the 5 greatest people who I ever had contact with as a musician, he would be in that 5. But this piece sounded nothing like an English piece. It sounded like a great Russian piece. If you listen to Nimrod, it's almost half the tempo of the original Elgar recording. It is so slow and it is so felt. It was so honest, but it was not the characteristic thing of. It was not the story that I was used to. So I think that there is a whole area of. It's kind of a vacuum, really, in a way, that is missing from our education as musicians. And I think there are wonderful pieces that we should be becoming familiar with. Because it's a different texture, it's a different expression, and I think it's necessary for us to be as complete as we can get, which is kind of forever. It's an endless journey. But I think that if we're missing a marvelous literature, then I think that we owe it to the teachers and scholars to introduce these pieces, and for the young people to learn these pieces, which is a big effort. Much easier to learn the Brahms concerto than it is to learn, I don't know, the Walton violin concerto or the Delius sonata or whatever. It's an easier thing because you know that you're going to get, possibly if you're good enough, you're going to get work. But we should get to a point where you can get work with everything that is beautiful.
Continuing on that thread, are there particularly prominent features of British music or musical fingerprints that to you define the genre, in term, whether specifically as a violinist or orchestral music in general? So you say
yes. I think that there is an you see that I think that in all nationalities, in all different countries, there is a character. We all have certain characteristics which belong to somehow where we're born, and that takes us almost for an entire lifetime. So I think I'm pretty sure that music is a major ingredient in our makeup, even if we're not actually conscious or aware of what we're listening to. There is a sound. There is a perfume which belongs to, I don't know, like in France. We know about Ravel. We know about Debussy. In England now, we know about Vaughan Williams. We know about, I'm talking about these very, very famous English composers. We know about Britain. We know, and this is a totally different flavor. We know about the American composers, different flavor. Know about the Russian composers. We know about Shostakovich, different flavor, different characteristic.
I want to return to some of your impressions of working with these composers in person. And earlier on, you ascribed the appeal of Britten's music to orchestral musicians as not only being the quality of the music itself, but the fact that they loved Britten as a person. What was Britten like to work with in the orchestra?
Very quiet man, very, very nice man. I mean, he was like, you know, the guy next door. He was, you know, he didn't dress or, you know, cut his hair in a certain way or do anything. He was just a nice guy that you saw like every day in the street. Everybody looked like that somehow. But he was very strong in a quiet way. He had great authority in a very quiet way. He would ask for something in a polite English way. I never saw him in any way excited. And all this music, I mean, we were dealing with a recording of the War Requiem. Nobody had ever played a note of that, and we had got like a week to do it, and Fischer Dieskau was singing, and Wisniewska was singing, and Britten was conducting, and the Mellows Ensemble was doing the chamber orchestra part, and it was quite a room full of, you know, seriously high level players, and of course Britten himself. So I think that how did I feel? Very polite, very nice. I know how much, I'm trying to think how much I actually learned from having worked with him. Not as much as from, say, an interpreter like Adrian Boult, or I didn't feel the presence. I learned more from Britten from listening to him play the piano, strangely enough. I learned more about his emotions. But I think that in his music is great power and great. There is a sound that is only Britten. It can only be Britten. And I mean, it's not the English countryside like Delius or some of the other composers.
Adrian Boult is a legend in this
Yes.
British music subject, and as a conductor who is inseparable in our imagination from so many of these composers, what was it like to just play under him? What connection did he seem to have that was so special with a composer like Vaughan Williams and others?
It was just him. It was basically just him. If you had to draw a characteristic or a cartoon of what an Englishman, an eccentric Englishman, would look like, you'd draw him. When I came back, because I'd worked so much with him on the London Philharmonic before I went to the New York Philharmonic, when I came back, and I'd been back in London for about 6 months, and I suddenly got a letter which really, actually at that time, made me feel very guilty. Because I was unaware that certain things, when you get old, are very, very, very much more important than when, because you're kind of a little bit out of the game, in that heavy game. So when I came back from America, Boult was in his 90s. And I got a letter one day, and it said, you know, it was about dear Rodney, I know that you've been back from America now for about 6 months, and I would love to hear about your experiences with all the conductors and with the orchestra and with the music and the composers, but if you don't have time, I quite understand, but I would love to see you. Now, I felt like this big. Here was somebody who I adored and worshipped as a musician, who was actually in need of some contact and nourishment from another musician who had taken part not taken part, I mean, I was just a player, I mean, just a leader of an orchestra. I felt so bad. I can remember I phoned his secretary immediately, and what was she called? I won't remember her name. But I said, I've had the letter from Sir Adrian, and I would love to see him. She said, oh, you know, he's not doing anything. He's just at home now, you know, because he's 96 or 90, I don't know how old he was certainly well into his 90s. And I said, well, I need to see him, because I want to talk to him and I want to discuss something. So she says, well, do you want to make a date? I said, yeah. She said, well, he's free. I said, well, can I come tomorrow? Absolutely. And so I went, and then I made it a regular thing, and I would go every week to see him. Just to have a cup of tea with him. And I used to tell him about the players and all the conductors who I'd worked with and so on. And that you know, sometimes he would be interested to know that I'd seen Samuel Barber and Copeland and those people. And then he was interested in the style of conducting of the generation after him. And he would show me letters from Elgar. And I mean, this was pure magic. But Boult hardly ever rehearsed. He had absolute faith in the musicians. Absolute, total faith in the musicians. So in actual fact, they knew that we were all skilled enough, not that to play through something was actually because it was the English way to we were great readers. We could really read very, very fast, and we could put performance together really in I don't know, an hour, in 2 hours. We could learn really anything. And so Boult did not rehearse very much. He sometimes lost his temper. If you didn't watch what, you know, I don't know whether you know this, but he wrote a book called The Point of the Stick. Did you ever read that?
Yeah.
Okay, so The Point of the Stick. And now, the stick happened to be was much longer than my violin bow. So, I mean, you know, it was kind of almost there, you know, in your eyes. So, if you didn't watch the point of that stick, he would get very, very, very upset. That's when he was like a young man of 75 or something. And his wife used to always send me little notes and say, keep him calm, just keep him calm, because he would get excited. He would bang the piano lid, but he wouldn't say anything. Everything was, and then he would become that kind of English thing. He had this amazing moustache, he had this wonderful face. And he was a tall man, very straight, and a wonderful voice, wonderful accent. So this was like the first Englishman, even though during that period, I was well in my 20s by then, he probably was the first Englishman I'd ever seen. Even though I'd spent a life living here. I mean, he was a totally different animal. I mean, he really, as opposed to somebody like Britten, who was like the guy next door, this was like George V, or Edward Elgar from the pictures or something. You know, the moustache was magnificent, and the point of the stick was amazing, because he could bend an orchestra in whatever direction he wanted, just with the point of that stick. He didn't have to say anything. And so, when I went and talked to him, the first thing, when I went to see him after I had that letter from him, the first thing that he says to me, that I said to him, I said, oh, Sir Adrian, I'm so sorry, I haven't been to see you. And I mean, I had never been to see him. This was the first time I'd ever been to his home to see him. But he was in need of talking about what he'd done all his life, and there was a few musicians who players who were close to him. And I said, how are you? And I swear, because it upset me a lot, he said to me, well, he said, it's very boring, you know, just sitting here waiting to die. That's exactly what he said. That's exactly what he said. And of course, for a moment, I mean, I was like heartbroken when I heard that, because I'd never heard when I was that age something like that. And because he looked so healthy and stately, and he was sitting in his big chair, and he was genuinely, he was waiting, for sure he was waiting with great dignity. And you know, I think that him and English music, it just was like one whole big thing for me, somehow.
You were born in England.
Yeah.
You've had an extraordinary international career, and throughout this interview you've made multiple references to your Jewish heritage. You
Yes.
described yourself as the son of Ukrainian
Yes.
immigrants, and yet you speak so passionately about British music and what's special about British music. And early, towards the beginning of this interview, you said that British music taught you something about the England I should have known better.
Yes.
And the last question I want to ask you is what has British music taught you about being British?
There is something in the whole British air which is to do with calmness, peacefulness. There is something a little bit tranquil in the, the English countryside is very beautiful. You can travel to all very historical places in this country. It's all very calm, and it's almost untouched. It remains as it was. I never saw, for example, in the American towns, they all look the same to me. The downtown, this place and this downtown, that place, all the downtowns look a bit the same to me. But this, there's hundreds of places here that I haven't been. They all have got a characteristic of their own, and it is so typical of this calmness and this peacefulness. And it's just about, it's about smelling the fields and the air and the countryside and so on. And I think that those composers must have absolutely adored all of that. They must have lived amongst that. And I think probably also that their friends must have been, they must have been just very, very ordinary, polite English people, not necessarily with posh accents or etc., but just with the characteristics which I find in the gentry of England, which I don't say, because I'm certainly not, but I don't say that with any kind of awe, but it's just a normality. I know if you go to a certain club, be a golf club or a tennis club or whatever. I mean, for example, you go to Wimbledon, it's got an atmosphere that you will not find at any other open tennis championship. I think that if you played in an English orchestra, you would feel a different thing amongst the players than what you felt when you go to New York Philharmonic or Moscow State Orchestra. So I think that the most, you can see that I moved now 20 miles outside of London because I couldn't stand the noise and the traffic. So, I overlook fields and trees and God knows what. I'm not cut off from society because that's not my character. And, all my kids live in London. But to tell you the truth, I can hear the birds song. Not so much when I just told you to listen, but I can. And I think that peacefulness enabled those composers to deliver that music.